In the harsh plains of Wyoming Territory, 1885, a story of ruthless greed and unexpected justice unfolds. When Sarah Henderson loses her husband to fever, her in-laws reveal their true nature. Within days, they seize everything: the family ranch, the cattle, even the clothes off her boys' backs. The town watches in silence as a widow and her sons are cast into the dirt, too afraid to stand against the powerful Mitchell clan. But they didn't count on Jake Cooper, a quiet cowboy with calloused hands and a steel-forged conscience. Taking in the broken family, he begins plotting something that will shake the very foundation of frontier justice. What could drive a peaceful man to risk everything for a widow he barely knows? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The carved wooden music box sat silent on Sarah Henderson's lap, its delicate pastoral scene worn smooth by years of loving touches. She hadn't wound it since Thomas drew his last breath 3 days ago, couldn't bear to hear "Beautiful Dreamer" without him beside her. The box had been his wedding gift to her, back when the Wyoming Territory still seemed wild with possibility rather than just wild with grief. "Mama!" James tugged at her black mourning dress, his 10-year-old face too serious for his years. "The preacher's waiting." Sarah nodded, gathering herself. Behind James, 8-year-old William clutched his brother's hand, tears tracking down his dusty cheeks. They stood together in the modest church that Thomas had helped build, its rough-hewn pews packed with townspeople who'd come to pay their respects, or perhaps just to witness what would happen next. Augustus Mitchell sat in the front row, his massive frame barely contained by his Sunday best. Thomas's father-in-law hadn't visited once during the fever, hadn't offered help when Sarah sent word that Thomas was failing. But here he was now, with his 3 sons arrayed beside him like crows on a fence, all in identical black suits that spoke of Eastern money. The preacher's words washed over Sarah like wind through prairie grass. She caught fragments about good men and God's mysterious ways, but her mind kept drifting to the morning Thomas had proposed. He'd been so nervous, this strong young rancher, with calloused hands and gentle eyes, fumbling the ring as he dropped to one knee in her father's kitchen. His family hadn't approved. The Mitchells had wanted him to marry a banker's daughter from Cheyenne, but Thomas had chosen love over legacy. A sudden movement caught her eye. Near the back of the church, a tall stranger shifted in his seat. Sarah hadn't seen him before, though that wasn't unusual for a frontier town where cowboys and drifters came and went with the seasons. Something about his bearing spoke of quiet strength, the way he sat alert but unassuming, like a man used to watching and waiting. Their eyes met briefly, and he offered a slight nod of respect before looking away. The service drew to a close, and people began filing past to offer condolences. Sarah accepted their awkward embraces and muttered prayers, all too aware of Augustus Mitchell's impatient fidgeting. The stranger from the back pew never came forward, and when Sarah looked again, he had vanished like morning mist. "Mrs. Henderson." Augustus's voice boomed across the now empty church. "We have business to discuss." Sarah's fingers tightened around the music box. "Thomas isn't even in the ground yet, Mr. Mitchell, which is precisely why we must settle things quickly." He produced a folded document from his coat. "For the boys' sake, of course. They'll need a proper roof over their heads, proper guidance." The threat in his words was subtle, but clear as Crystal Creek water. Sarah felt James press against her side, his small body trembling. William had started crying again, silent tears that broke her heart. "The reading of the will," she began, "has already been arranged." Augustus smiled, all teeth and no warmth. "Tomorrow morning first thing. The lawyer's waiting." He turned to go, then paused. "Oh, and Sarah, don't go filling those boys' heads with stories about their father's wishes." Thomas knew where his true obligations lay. The Mitchell men filed out, their boot heels clicking against the wooden floor like hammers driving nails into Sarah's future. She sat there long after they'd gone, holding her sons close, the music box heavy in her lap. Through the church window, She could see Thomas's fresh-dug grave on the hill, where prairie flowers would bloom come spring. If only he'd told her more about the ranch's paperwork, about the deals and documents that Augustus had always handled. But Thomas had protected her from all that, wanting her to focus on making their house a home, on raising their boys to be good men. Now she wished she'd insisted on knowing everything, because tomorrow morning, Sarah Henderson had a feeling she'd discover exactly how much she'd lost, and it wouldn't just be her husband. Philip Warner's law office smelled of dust and leather-bound books, with morning sunlight streaming through grimy windows to illuminate dancing motes in the air. Sarah sat rigid in a straight-backed chair, her sons pressed close on either side. Across the desk, Warner wouldn't meet her eyes as he shuffled through papers with trembling hands. Augustus Mitchell lounged against the wall like he owned it, which, Sarah realized with growing dread, he probably soon would. His sons flanked the door, as if daring anyone to leave before their father was satisfied. "Well?" Augustus's voice cracked like a whip. "We're waiting, Warner." The lawyer cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. "Yes, well, I have here the last will and testament of Thomas James Henderson, dated—" He paused, squinting at the document. 3 weeks ago. Sarah's heart stopped. That's impossible. Thomas was already delirious with fever then. He couldn't even hold a pen. "Nevertheless, Mrs. Henderson, his signature is quite clear." Warner turned the document around, showing a shaky but legible scrawl at the bottom. "Witnessed and notarized properly. By whom?" Sarah leaned forward, scanning the page. The names meant nothing to her, but Augustus's slight smile told her everything she needed to know. "To business," Warner continued, his voice growing steadier as he read from the formal text. "Being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath, in consideration of outstanding debts and familial obligations." He paused, swallowing hard. "The Henderson Ranch, including all structures, livestock, and associated property, is to be transferred to Augustus Mitchell, to be held in trust for the proper administration of all outstanding obligations." The room spun. Sarah gripped the arms of her chair, feeling James and William pressing closer, their small bodies trembling. What obligations? What debts? Thomas never mentioned— "Your husband was too proud to worry you with such matters." Augustus stepped forward, laying a document on Warner's desk. "This loan agreement, signed 2 years ago during the drought, pledged the ranch as collateral. Thomas knew what would happen if he couldn't meet the payments." Sarah stared at the paper, at Thomas's signature beneath rows of dense legal text. "Why wouldn't he tell me? Perhaps he hoped to spare you the shame of his failure." Augustus's voice dripped false sympathy. "The drought hit everyone hard, but Thomas— well, he made some poor decisions. Fortunately, family takes care of its own. We'll ensure his sons are provided for, properly educated, properly guided." "You mean taken from me?" Sarah's voice shook with sudden understanding. "You never approved of Thomas marrying beneath his station. This is your revenge, isn't it?" Augustus's face hardened. "Watch yourself, Mrs. Henderson. You're speaking to your children's legal guardian now. The will is quite clear on that point as well." "No." Sarah stood, her chair scraping back. "I don't care what that paper says. Thomas would never—" "Mrs. Henderson." Warner's quiet voice cut through her protest. "I'm sorry, but the document is legally binding. All the signatures are verified. There's nothing—" He trailed off, unable to finish. In the silence, William began to cry, soft, hiccuping sobs that tore at Sarah's heart. "You have until sunset to vacate the ranch." Augustus straightened his vest, already turning to leave. "We'll need to begin spring preparations immediately. Can't let sentiment interfere with business." He paused at the door, looking back at Sarah with cold eyes. "I suggest you focus on finding suitable employment. A woman in your position can't afford pride." The Mitchell brothers filed out after their father, boots echoing down the wooden walkway. Outside, Sarah sat frozen, her sons clinging to her skirts as Warner shuffled papers with shaking hands. "Mrs. Henderson, the lawyer's voice cracked. If there was anything I could do, but they both knew there wasn't. In the Wyoming Territory of 1885, a piece of paper with the right signatures meant more than truth or justice. Sarah gathered her boys close, breathing in their familiar scents, trying to find strength she wasn't sure she possessed. Outside the window, she caught a glimpse of movement. The stranger from the funeral, watching from across the street. For a moment, their eyes met again, and something in his steady gaze gave her a flicker of hope. Then a wagon passed between them, and he was gone, leaving Sarah to face the impossible task of telling her children they were about to lose the only home they'd ever known. Sarah stood in her kitchen, no, not hers anymore, watching Augustus Mitchell's men empty her home like vultures stripping a carcass. They worked with brutal efficiency, tossing furniture onto wagons, claiming anything of value. William clutched his favorite toy soldier, a wooden figure Thomas had carved for his 6th birthday, pressing it close to his chest whenever one of the men passed too near. "That trunk stays," Sarah said sharply, as 2 ranch hands lifted her mother's hope chest. "It contains personal items only, no value to anyone but us." Augustus emerged from Thomas's study, a ledger in his hands. "Actually, Mrs. Henderson, according to this morning's ruling, everything belongs to the Mitchell family now." He smiled thinly. "But I'm feeling generous. Take what you can carry, nothing more." James, her brave 10-year-old, stepped forward. "Sir, that trunk has Mama's wedding dress in it, and Pa's letters and—" "Quiet, boy." Augustus's voice could have frozen creek water. "Best learn early that sentiment is a poor substitute for sound business practices. Your father never learned. Won't that lesson see where it got him?" Sarah pulled James back, feeling him trembling with fury and fear. The boy was too much like his father, wearing his heart boldly on his sleeve. She had to protect him now, had to teach him to guard his feelings better than Thomas ever had. Through the window, she could see the Mitchell brothers directing the removal of Thomas's prized Hereford bulls, breeding stock he'd spent years developing. The animals bellowed in confusion as they were driven from their familiar pastures. "Like us," Sarah thought bitterly, "cast out from everything we know." "Mama?" William tugged at her skirt. "Can't we take Mr. Buttons?" The old tomcat had been a fixture on the ranch since before William's birth, keeping the barn free of mice and the boys full of laughter. "Animals are property." Augustus cut in before Sarah could respond. "The cat stays." William's face crumpled, but he didn't cry. Sarah saw him tuck the toy soldier deeper into his pocket, the only piece of home he'd be allowed to keep. They ended up with 2 carpet bags. Sarah had managed to secretly slip some of Thomas's letters inside, along with a few small photographs and the boys' baby shoes. The rest of their lives, every stitch, every memory, every treasured piece of the family they'd built, was loaded onto Mitchell wagons and carried away. As the sun settled toward the western horizon, painting the prairie in mocking shades of gold, Augustus stood on the porch of what had been Sarah's home for 12 years. "Time to go, Mrs. Henderson. I trust you've made arrangements?" Sarah lifted her chin. "The church has offered us shelter." She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. "Temporary arrangements until you come to your senses." Augustus raised an eyebrow. "The offer stands. Sign over. Custody of the boys, and we'll ensure they're raised as proper Mitchells. You could even stay on as a housekeeper if you're willing to remember your place." "Never!" The word came out like a bullet. Augustus shrugged. "Pride goeth before a fall. Mrs. Henderson, remember that when winter comes." They walked away from their home as the setting sun painted long shadows across the yard. Sarah held her son's hands, feeling the weight of their trust like a physical burden. As they passed the barn, a flash of orange fur darted out. Mr. Buttons, following William with determined loyalty. "Shoo," Sarah whispered, heartbreaking. "Go home, cat." But Mr. Buttons paid no attention, padding along behind them as they made their way toward town. From somewhere in the gathering dusk came the sound of horses, the Mitchell men, beginning their first night of ownership with a patrol of their expanded territory. Sarah felt eyes on them as they walked. The mysterious stranger again, she thought. though she couldn't be sure in the failing light. Part of her wanted to hate him, hate everyone who had watched this happen without raising a voice in protest. But she understood their fear. The Mitchells had been breaking people in this territory. For 20 years, William stumbled, tired from the long day, and Sarah picked him up despite her own exhaustion. His toy soldier pressed against her shoulder, one small piece of Thomas they'd managed to save. As they approached the church, its steeple stark against the darkening sky, Sarah made a silent promise to her dead husband. Somehow, some way, she would find justice, not just for their sons, but for every person the Mitchells had ever broken. She just had no idea how. Dawn found Sarah and her boys huddled on the hard wooden pew. Mr. Buttons curled at William's feet, despite the preacher's protests about animals in the church. The cat had refused to leave, as stubborn in his loyalty as Thomas had always said. He was. Sarah watched dust motes dance in the early morning light, her body aching from the sleepless night, when a shadow darkened the church doorway. The stranger from the funeral stood there, hat in hand, revealing dark hair touched with grey. At the temples, a worn cavalry badge glinted dully on his faded work jacket, not displayed proudly, but rather as if he'd forgotten it was there. His eyes, Sarah noticed, were the color of Wyoming sky just before a storm. Mrs. Henderson. His voice was quiet, with a slight rasp that spoke of years spent in wind and weather. Name's Jake Cooper. Wonder if I might have a word. Sarah straightened, instinctively placing herself between the stranger and her sleeping boys. If you're working for the Mitchells, no. Something flickered in those storm cloud eyes. Never had much use for men who hide cruelty behind paper and law. He stepped inside, movements careful and deliberate, like a man used to dealing with spooked horses. The cavalry badge caught the light again, and Sarah noticed it bore the marks. Of heavy combat, Union Army, she guessed, though the war had ended 20 years ago. I've got a place, he said, without preamble. Nothing fancy. Cabin about 3 miles out, with a decent well and good grazing. Too much space for one man. He paused, choosing his words. Thought maybe you and your boys might want to stay there, just until things get sorted. Sarah studied him, looking for the trap. Everyone in town knew the Mitchells would take a dim view of anyone helping their cast-off in-laws. Why? Jake Cooper's weathered face softened slightly. Because 20 years ago I watched another powerful family destroy good people through papers and laws. Swore then I'd never stand by silent again. He touched the cavalry badge unconsciously. Your husband was a good man, Mrs. Henderson. Helped. Me once, when my horse came up lame, wouldn't take a penny for his trouble. Man like that, his family deserves better than church floorboards. William stirred on the pew, blinking awake. Mama? Who's that? Name's Jake, Cooper said, crouching down to the boy's level. Hear you're quite the horseman yourself. William's eyes widened at the cavalry badge. Were you a soldier, sir? Long time ago. Jake's smile held a shadow of old pain. These days, I mostly break horses for the local ranches, except the Mitchells. Their methods and mine don't quite agree. Sarah saw something in that smile, something that spoke of quiet strength and carefully banked anger. She thought of the long winter ahead, of her boys sleeping on hard wooden benches while the Mitchells lived in their home. The cabin, she said. Carefully. How long could we stay? Long as you need. Jake straightened up, keeping his movements slow and unthreatening. I usually camp near whatever ranch has hired me anyway. Cabin's just a place to store my gear between jobs. James had woken too, watching the exchange with his father's sharp intelligence. Why don't you work for the Mitchells, Mr. Cooper? Jake considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Because a man's got to look himself in the mirror every morning, son. Some things aren't worth any amount of pay. Sarah felt something shift in her chest. Hope, maybe, or at least the beginning of it. The Mitchells won't like it. No, Mom, they surely won't. Jake's eyes held steady on hers. But a man's business is his own out here. Even Augustus Mitchell can't dictate who I shelter under my roof. Mr. Buttons had padded over to Jake, sniffing his boots with careful consideration before rubbing against his leg. Sarah almost smiled. The old cat had always been a good judge of character. 3 miles, you said. She stood, gathering their meager belongings. Which direction? North, along Fisher Creek. Land's not much, but the water's good and the roof doesn't leak. He reached for their carpet bags. Got a wagon outside, if you'll allow me? Sarah nodded, watching as her boys brightened at the prospect of escape from the church's shadowy confines. As Jake carried their bags out, she saw the first real smile on James's face since Thomas died. Maybe, she thought, following Jake Cooper into the morning light. This was what answered prayers looked like. Not grand gestures or miraculous reversals, but simple kindness offered without strings or judgment. And maybe, just maybe, it was a beginning. Jake's cabin perched on a gentle rise overlooking Fisher Creek, its weathered logs and stone chimney half hidden by tall grass. A hand-drawn map lay spread across his rough-hewn table, showing the property's boundaries and carefully noted features: springs, sheltered hollows, and the best grazing spots. Sarah studied it while Jake carried in their few possessions, her eyes tracking the neat annotations in his precise handwriting. "It's not much," Jake said, setting down their bags. "But the creek never runs dry, and there's good hunting in those woods to the north." His finger traced a section of the map marked with small crosses. "Been clearing that bottom land, thinking about putting in a vegetable patch come spring." The cabin's single room was sparse but meticulously clean. A pot of coffee bubbled on the iron stove, and dried herbs hung from the rafters: sage, yarrow, and other plants Sarah recognized from her own garden, now lost to the Mitchells. "You know about medicinal herbs?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. Jake's weathered face softened slightly. "My mother was a healer. Taught me a thing or two before the fever took her." He turned to the boys who were exploring the cabin's corners with cautious curiosity. "William, that chest by the window, open it up." William did, gasping at what he found. "Mama, look, saddles." "Training saddles," Jake corrected gently. "For teaching young horses and young riders. Thought you boys might want to learn if your mama agrees." Sarah watched James's eyes light up, remembering how Thomas had promised to teach him riding properly when he turned 11. Another promise the Mitchells had stolen, but here was Jake, offering it back without fanfare or fuss. "The creek's good. For fishing, too," Jake continued, pouring coffee into tin cups. "Trout, mostly. Smoke them in the fall for winter storing." He hesitated, then pulled a worn ledger from his saddlebag. "Been keeping track of what this land could support. With some work, might manage a small herd by next year. Nothing fancy, but enough to get by." Sarah studied his careful planning, the detailed notes on grazing rotation and water access. This wasn't just idle charity. Jake Cooper had been preparing this place for something more than a solitary cowboy's shelter. "Why?" she asked again, needing to understand. Jake was quiet for a long moment, watching William and James examine the saddles. "Because sometimes a man needs more than justice. Sometimes he needs to build something good to balance out the bad he's seen." He touched his cavalry badge unconsciously, and Sarah wondered what memories haunted those storm cloud eyes. Before she could ask, Mr. Buttons leaped onto the table, sniffing the map with proprietary interest. "That old Tom's already claimed the best sleeping spot by the stove," Jake said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Reckon he's decided this is home now." Home. The word echoed in Sarah's chest, like distant thunder. She watched her boys exploring, their earlier fear temporarily forgotten in the excitement of new discoveries. James had found a shelf of books. Proper. E-books, not just dime novels, while William was peering out windows at the creek sparkling in the morning sun. "The Mitchells," she said softly. "They won't let this rest." "No, Mom. They surely won't." Jake's voice held quiet steel. "But a man's land is his own out here, and I've got papers as solid as theirs." He smiled slightly. "Besides, Augustus Mitchell might find it interesting to learn what else I picked up during the war besides this old badge." Sarah heard the promise in those words, saw the careful way Jake had positioned the cabin for clear views in all directions. This wasn't just shelter he was offering. It was protection, and maybe something more. "We'll need supplies," she said, making her decision. "And the boys will need proper clothes before winter." Jake nodded, relief flickering across his face. "Town's having a market day tomorrow. We can get what you need then." He paused. "And Mrs. Henderson? Welcome home." Home. Yes, Sarah thought, watching Jake show James how to oil a saddle properly. Maybe not the home they'd lost, but something new. Something built on choice rather than theft, on kindness rather than cruelty. And if Augustus Mitchell didn't like it, well, she'd seen something in Jake Cooper's eyes that suggested he'd been hoping for just such a fight. The yellowed newspaper clipping lay on Jake's table, its edges frayed with age. "Mitchell Land Holdings Expand," the headline declared, dated 5 years earlier. Sarah read the article by lamplight while Jake cleaned his rifle nearby. The boys already asleep in the corner bed he'd built for them. "Third family that year," Jake said quietly, his hands moving with practiced efficiency over the weapon. "The Burkes, good people, had worked that land for 12 years before Augustus found a mistake in their deed." Sarah traced the printed words with her finger. "It says they left for California. They didn't make it." Jake's voice held old anger. "Wagon broke down outside Rock Springs. Burke took work in the coal mines, died 6 months later. His widow's still there, taking in washing to feed their kids." The article praised Augustus Mitchell's business acumen and vision for territorial development. Below it was a photograph, showing him standing proudly before the town bank, his sons flanking him like particularly well-dressed wolves. "Here's another." Jake pulled out more clippings from an old leather portfolio. "The Jensen place, 2 years before your husband." He stopped, watching her face. "Sorry, maybe you don't need to see all this." "No." Sarah straightened her spine. "I need to understand what we're facing." The stories unfolded before her, a pattern of destruction hidden behind legal papers and banknotes. The Jensens, the Burkes, the Wilsons, all solid farming families who'd somehow run afoul of Augustus Mitchell's expansion plans. Some had lost their land to mysterious debt, others to suddenly discovered deed problems or tax issues. "How does he do it?" Sarah asked, scanning another article about a widow forced to sell her ranch at a fraction of its value. Surely someone must have fought back. Jake's hands stilled on his rifle. "Man tried about 10 years back. Josh McAllister had evidence of Mitchell tampering with land office records." He reached for another clipping, then stopped. "They found him in Fisher Creek. Augustus claimed he'd been drinking, fell from his horse. Nobody asked why McAllister's saddlebags, the ones supposedly containing the evidence, were never found." Sarah felt a chill despite the cabin's warmth. From the corner came William's soft snoring, punctuated by Mr. Button's contented purr. "And the law, territory still wild. Marshall covers too much ground to dig deep, and the local sheriff," Jake's mouth twisted. "Let's just say his pocket watch came from the Mitchell family's personal jeweler." He stood, moving to check the cabin's windows, a habit Sarah had noticed he repeated every hour like clockwork. The cavalry badge on his jacket caught the lamplight, and she suddenly wondered if his watchfulness came from more than just his military past. "You've been gathering information," she said, not really a question. "All these years, watching, collecting proof." Jake nodded slowly. "Been careful about it. Learning from others' mistakes. Augustus is smart. He never leaves paper trails leading straight to him. Always works through proxies, creates legitimate-looking documents." He touched one of the clippings. "But patterns emerge if you know where to look. And you've been looking." "Yes, ma'am." His eyes met hers, storm cloud gray hardening to steel. "Just been waiting for the right moment, the right cause." Sarah glanced at her sleeping boys, thinking of all they'd lost. "And now we have something Augustus doesn't expect." Jake sat back down, spreading the clippings like cards in a poker hand. "A witness he can't intimidate or buy off. Your husband might not have told you everything, but you lived on that Ranch 12 years. You know names, dates, visitors, and you've got something else Mitchell's other victims didn't. What's that? Jake's smile held no humor. Me, man who spent 8 years learning every detail of Augustus Mitchell's empire, every weak spot in his armor. He gestured at the clippings. And I've learned something interesting. Empires built on paper can burn mighty quick if you know where to strike the match. Sarah studied the articles again, seeing them with new eyes. Each story was a thread in a larger tapestry of corruption, and somewhere in that pattern lay the key to their salvation. It will be dangerous. Yes, Jake didn't insult her with false reassurance. But sometimes the most dangerous path is the only one that leads to justice. Outside, an owl called into the darkness. Sarah thought of Thomas, of all the other families broken by Mitchell greed. Then we'd better get started, she said, pulling the clippings closer. Tell me everything you know. And as the lamp burned, lo, they began to plan their own kind of justice, one that would use Augustus Mitchell's greatest weapon, his beloved papers and contracts, to bring his empire crashing down around his ears. Jake's leather journal lay open on the split log fence, its pages covered in what looked like random numbers and letters. Sarah watched from the cabin door as he showed James how to brush down a young mare, his hands guiding the boy's movements. With gentle patience, always long strokes following the direction of the hair, Jake explained, demonstrating the technique. Horse'll tell you if you're doing it right. See how she's leaning into the brush? That means you've got it. James nodded seriously, his face set in concentration. He'd been quiet since they'd lost the ranch, but with Jake, words seemed to come. Easier. Pa used to say horses remember kindness longer than anything else. Your pa was a wise man. Jake's voice held warm approval. Speaking of remembering, what's rule number 3? Always check their hooves before and after riding, James recited promptly. And rule number 4 is never approach from their blind spots. William sat nearby in the morning sun, carefully copying something from Jake's journal into his own small notebook. Simple codes Jake had been teaching them, disguised as a game. Sarah knew better. Every lesson, whether with horses or hidden messages, was building towards something larger. That's good work, William, Jake called over. Remember what I told you about keeping your letters small and neat, so they don't stand out, William replied, tongue caught between his teeth as he concentrated. Just like regular writing, so nobody thinks to look twice. Sarah felt her throat tighten. These weren't lessons any 8-year-old should need to learn, but they were necessary. Just yesterday, they'd spotted one of the Mitchell boys riding along their fence line, watching the cabin with too casual interest. Jake had been teaching them other things too, how to move quietly through brush, how to spot approaching riders, by watching birds scatter, how to remember important details without writing them down. All disguised as games and stories, but Sarah recognized the survival skills of a man who'd learned them the hard way. "Mama!" William called suddenly. "Look what I can do!" He held up his notebook, showing a message he'd encoded using Jake's system. Sarah walked over, noting how Jake tensed slightly, scanning the horizon before relaxing again. "Very nice, sweetheart," she said, reading the simple code. "But remember—" "I know," William sighed. "Never write anything important in the practice book. That's for random words only." Jake nodded approvingly, then turned back to James and the mare. "Now about riding. Remember how we talked about balance? Show me how you'd mount up." Sarah watched James demonstrate the proper technique, his movements careful and precise. He was growing more confident daily under Jake's tutelage, learning not just about horses, but about patience, strategy, and the quiet strength that came from knowing rather than showing. Later, as the boys helped Jake repair a section of fence, Sarah opened his journal, studying the complex codes and careful observations hidden within its pages. Between notes about horse training and weather patterns lay the real message, detailed records of Mitchell family movements, business dealings, and vulnerabilities, all concealed in plain sight. "They're good boys," Jake said quietly, coming up beside her. "Quick learners." "You're good with them," Sarah replied, watching William hand his father's tools to Jake with complete trust. "But all this, the codes, the watching, the careful planning, will it be enough?" Jake's eyes tracked a distant dust cloud that meant riders on the main road. Augustus Mitchell thinks knowledge is power, but he hoards it like a miser with gold. Makes him predictable. He smiled slightly. And predictable men make mistakes. Is that what you learned in the war? Learned it after, actually. Jake touched his ever-present cavalry badge. War taught me how to fight. Peace taught me there's always more than one way to win. He nodded toward the boys. They understand more than we think. James especially. He sees how it all connects. Sarah watched her sons working alongside Jake, seeing how naturally they'd adapted to his quiet, strength and careful ways. They were learning more than just ranch work and codes. They were learning how to stand against injustice without becoming hard or cruel themselves. Thank you, she said softly, for all of this. Jake's hand brushed hers briefly, calloused fingers. Warm against her skin. Family protects its own, Mrs. Henderson. Even family you choose along the way. The word hung between them, full of promise and possibility, as the Wyoming sun painted long shadows across their small piece of hard-won ground. The forged Mitchell family ledger sat between them on Jake's table, its leather binding cracked with age and use. Sarah's hands trembled as she turned the pages, recognizing Thomas's supposed signature on loan documents dated during his fever-racked final days. Look here, Jake said softly, pointing to a column of numbers. See how the sevens are written, the way they curl at the top? He pulled out another document, a bank draft from 3 years earlier. Same hand wrote both. But this, one signed by Augustus's middle son, Robert. Sarah studied the matching handwriting, anger burning in her chest. They didn't even try to hide it. They never had to before. Jake's voice held grim satisfaction. Nobody ever lived long enough to compare the documents. But you remember Thomas's real signature, don't you? Sarah reached into her dress pocket, withdrawing a carefully preserved letter, the last one Thomas had written her before the fever took hold. He always made his tea with an extra loop. Said his father taught him that way. She laid it beside. The forged documents. These signatures don't have it. Evidence. Jake said quietly. But we need more. And we need to move careful. Augustus has friends at the land office, the bank, even the territorial court in Cheyenne. A floorboard creaked, and they both turned to find James standing in the doorway, face serious in the lamplight. I remember something, he said, about Mr. Robert Mitchell. Jake nodded encouragingly. What do you recall, son? The day before Pa got sick. Mr. Robert came to the ranch, wanted Pa to sign some papers. They argued. James's brow furrowed with the effort of remembering. Pa said something about backdated contracts and threw him out. That's when, he swallowed hard, that's when Mr. Robert said Pa would regret being difficult. Sarah felt ice in her veins. A week later, Thomas was burning with fever. Might be coincidence, Jake said, but his eyes had hardened. Either way, it shows Robert Mitchell was trying to get signatures before your husband fell ill. Undermines their whole story about Thomas signing everything away willingly at the end. He made a note in his coded journal, then turned back to James. Thank you for remembering that. Every piece helps us build the truth. James squared his shoulders, looking so much like Thomas that Sarah's heart ached. I want to help more. I remember other things, conversations I heard, people who came to the ranch. Jake exchanged a glance with Sarah, who nodded slightly. All right, he said, but we do this carefully. Tell me everything you remember and we'll write it down in code. Nobody else can know you're helping. Understood? Yes, sir. James paused. Mr. Jake. What happens when we have enough evidence? Then we take it to someone who can't be bought. Jake touched his cavalry badge. Man I served with in the war. He's a federal judge now, over in Denver. Augustus Mitchell may own this territory, but federal law still means something. Sarah watched her son absorb this, seeing him grasp the magnitude of what they were attempting. It's dangerous, isn't it? James asked quietly. Yes, Jake didn't sugarcoat it. But sometimes doing right is dangerous. That's why we're careful. Why we plan everything. Your job is to keep being brave and smart, and to protect your brother. Let your mama and me handle the rest." James nodded solemnly. "Like a real cavalry scout." "Better." Jake smiled slightly. "Like a son protecting his family." The boy straightened. At that, and Sarah saw something new in his bearing, not just determination, but pride. He was healing, she realized. They all were, building something stronger from the ashes of what they'd lost. "Time for bed," she said gently. "And James, thank you for telling us. Your father would be proud." After James had gone, Sarah turned. Back to the ledger. "How many more documents do we need?" "A few." Jake's fingers traced the false signatures. "But more importantly, we need to shake their confidence. Make them wonder who else might be watching, what other evidence might exist." His eyes met hers. "Are you ready for that?" Sarah thought of Thomas, of James's revelation, of all the other families the Mitchells had destroyed. "Yes," she said, "it's time they learned what it feels like to be haunted by their own past." Together, they bent over the ledger, plotting. Their first move in a game where justice would finally have its day. The collection of witness statements grew beneath Jake's floorboards, each testimony carefully written and hidden away like buried treasure. Sarah sat cross-legged beside the loose plank, reading the latest edition by candlelight, a sworn account from Martha Burke, sent all the way from Rock Springs. "My Harold never signed those papers," Martha's shaky handwriting declared. "He was out mending fences the day they claim he came to town. We had dinner together, watched the sunset, but when we tried to prove it, suddenly, nobody could remember seeing him that evening." Jake entered the cabin, shaking rain from his hat. "Got another one," he said quietly, pulling a folded paper from inside his jacket. "Ben Wilson's oldest boy finally wrote down what he saw the night their barn burned." Sarah added it to the growing collection. "How many now?" 17. Jake secured the floorboard, then built up the fire against the autumn chill. "And something else. Heard interesting talk in town today. Seems Augustus's youngest boy, Edward, had trouble getting credit at the Mercantile." "What kind of trouble?" "Owner's wife lost a brother to the Mitchell schemes few years back. She finally spoke up, told other customers about it." Jake's eyes held quiet satisfaction. First time anyone's dared talk openly. Sarah thought of the careful groundwork they'd laid over the past months. Anonymous letters to former victims, asking for their stories, discreet questions in town about old land deals. Rumors carefully planted about federal investigations into territory fraud. Small things, but like drops of water wearing away stone. "Augustus won't take that kindly," she said. "No." Jake poured coffee for them both. "Already sent Robert to discuss things with the owner, but here's what's interesting. Stores still refusing Mitchell credit. Owner said he'd rather close shop than bow down again." Hope flickered in Sarah's chest. "Others will notice that. They already have." Jake sat beside her, their shoulders touching. "Saw Lewis Parker in town. You remember him. Owns the livery stable." Sarah nodded. Thomas had often talked of Lewis's fair dealing and quiet integrity. "He asked about you," Jake continued. "Said he never believed Thomas would have signed away. Your boy's future. Offered to write down what he remembers about Augustus's visits to the ranch that last week. Is it safe for him?" "Safer than it used to be. Mitchell Power's built on fear and silence. Break that silence." Jake smiled slightly. "Well, Augustus is learning that fear's a currency that loses value once people start spending it." A soft noise made them both turn. William stood in the corner, clutching his toy soldier. "I couldn't sleep," he said. "The rain sounds like horses." Jake rose smoothly, checking the windows before going to the boy. "Want to learn another tracking trick? Something my father taught me about listening to rain?" William nodded eagerly, and Jake led him to the cabin door, opening it slightly. "Hear how it hits the roof, like music almost. But if horses approach, that music changes. Rain sounds different, hitting moving bodies than still ones." Sarah watched them, marveling at Jake's patience, his way of turning fear into learning. William's nightmares had grown less frequent since moving to the cabin, but they still came. Memories of being cast out, of watching the Mitchells take everything. "Try closing your eyes," Jake suggested. "Listen real careful. Can you hear the difference between rain on wood and rain on grass?" William concentrated, his small face serious. "Yes. The grass is softer?" "That's right. Good ear." Jake ruffled the boy's hair. "Now you'll always know what's rain and what's riders, even in the dark." Later, after William had finally drifted off, Sarah found Jake adding notes to his journal. "You're good with them," she said softly. "Better than a rough old cavalry scout has any right to be." His voice held gentle amusement. "That's not what I meant." "I know." He looked up, eyes soft in the firelight. "Sarah, horses." Whinny cut through the rain. They both tensed, but Jake relaxed almost immediately. "Just thunder greeting Mr. Buttons. That old cat still hunts, rain or shine." But they'd both moved instinctively, Jake to the rifle by the door, Sarah to stand. Between the noise and her sleeping sons, the habits of wariness had become as natural as breathing. "Soon," Jake said quietly, reading her thoughts. "We're almost ready. And when we move, the Mitchells won't know what hit them." Outside, the rain continued its steady percussion on the cabin roof, but now Sarah heard it differently, not as a threat, but as cover for justice gathering like a storm on the horizon. The old photograph slipped from between the pages of Jake's Bible, worn sepia tones, showing a younger man in Union blue, standing proud beside a woman and two small children. Sarah caught it before it could fall into the fireplace, her breath catching as she recognized Jake's face, unlined by years and worry. "Maryland, 63, Jake said quietly from the doorway, startling her. "Before Gettysburg, before everything changed." Sarah studied the woman's face, the children's bright eyes. "Your family?" "Rebecca, Daniel, little Mary." His voice held ancient grief. "While I was fighting, a group of men like Augustus Mitchell decided our farm would make a fine addition to their holdings. Created debt that never existed," claimed Rebecca. "Had signed papers she'd never seen." He moved to the fire, staring into the flames. "By the time I made it home, they were gone. Fever, they said. But fever doesn't explain why they were living in a tent by the river instead of our home." The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands. "That's why you've been fighting the Mitchells all these years. Part of it." Jake turned, his eyes holding something she'd never seen before, a fierce, burning purpose beneath his usual calm. "Mostly it's because I learned that evil doesn't need armies to destroy lives. Sometimes all it needs is a few men with clean hands and dirty souls, hiding behind legal papers while they steal everything that matters." Sarah thought of Thomas, of all the other families the Mitchells had broken. "But this time it's different." "Yes." Jake took the photograph gently, touching the faces of his lost family. "Because this time we're not just gathering evidence, we're gathering people. The Burkes, the Wilsons, everyone who's lost something to Mitchell greed. They're ready to speak now." A horse nickered outside, and Jake moved to the window with practiced vigilance. But it was only James returning from his errands in town, his face flushed with excitement despite the cold. "Mr. Jake," he called, bursting through the door. "You were right. I heard Robert Mitchell talking at the saloon. They're worried about some federal marshal asking questions down in Cheyenne." Jake's eyes met Sarah's. They hadn't sent any information to Cheyenne yet. The Mitchells' own guilty conscience was making them jump at shadows. "Good work," Jake said, helping James with his coat. "Anyone see you listening?" "No, sir, I was playing marbles with Tommy Lewis. Just like you said, they didn't even look our way." James grinned, proud of his newfound skills in subtle observation. "And I remembered something else. They mentioned papers in a safe at the bank, something about the original deeds." Jake's expression sharpened. "You're sure about that?" "Yes, sir. Robert said they needed to clean things up before any marshal starts poking around." Sarah felt her heart race. "If we could get those papers, we'd have proof of every land theft they've committed." Jake was already moving, pulling out his journal. "James, you did real good work today. Real good." The boy beamed at the praise, then noticed the photograph still in Jake's hand. "Who are they?" Jake hesitated only a moment before showing him. "My family. Long time ago." James studied the image solemnly. "What happened to them?" "Men like Augustus Mitchell happened." Jake's voice was gentle despite the hard truth. "That's why we're making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Sarah watched her son process this, seeing understanding dawn in his young face. "Is that why you helped us? Because of them?" "Partly." Jake glanced at Sarah, something warm in his eyes. "But also because sometimes God gives a man a second chance to do right by a family, even if it's not the one he was born to." The moment stretched, full of unspoken feelings, until William's voice broke it. "Can we have flapjacks for supper?" Sarah laughed, grateful for the innocent interruption. "I suppose we could manage that." As she gathered supplies from Jake's well-stocked pantry, she watched him show the boys his cavalry photograph, answering their questions about the war with careful honesty. He was teaching them more than survival now. He was showing them how to hold on to humanity even while fighting injustice. Later, after the boys were asleep, Jake added James's intelligence about the bank safe to his journal. "It's time," he said, quietly. "We've got enough witnesses willing to testify. If we can get those original deeds, the Mitchells will fight harder than ever." Yes, he touched the photograph of his lost family, but this time they're fighting more than just one broken man. This time they're facing every person they've ever wronged, all standing together. Sarah laid her hand over his. "And they're facing us." His fingers intertwined with hers, warm and strong and full of promise. Outside, snow began to fall, but inside Jake Cooper's cabin, the fire of justice burned bright and true. The threatening note lay on Jake's doorstep like a coiled rattler, its message stark against the rough paper. "Some debts can only be paid in blood. Ask the McAllisters." Sarah's hands shook as she read it, remembering Jake's story about the man found floating in Fisher Creek. "They're scared," Jake said, studying the note's careful handwriting. "Augustus Mitchell doesn't make threats unless he's losing control." "That's supposed to make me feel better?" Sarah watched William and James, playing with Mr. Buttons near the barn, their laughter carrying on the crisp morning air. "They killed a man for having evidence, Jake, and now we have more than McAllister ever did. We also have something he didn't." Jake tucked the note into his journal. "People ready to stand with us? Look." He nodded toward the road where Lewis Parker's wagon was approaching, loaded with supplies. Behind it came the widow Burke's eldest son, leading a string of horses. More riders appeared on the horizon, families who'd lost land to the Mitchells, coming together at last. "Word's spreading," Jake said quietly, "about the federal investigation, about the evidence we've gathered. Augustus can't silence everyone anymore." As if to prove his point, shots rang out from the direction of town. Both of them moved instantly, Jake grabbing his rifle, Sarah rushing to get the boys inside. But the gunfire wasn't meant for them, at least not yet. "That'll be the Mitchell boys," Lewis Parker said grimly as he pulled up to the cabin. "They rode through town this morning, shooting up anything that belonged to folks who've spoken against them. Already put 3 holes in my stable roof. Anyone hurt?" "Not yet. But Robert Mitchell was drunk, talking big about making examples." Lewis spat in the dust. "Thing is, nobody's running scared this time. Thompson at the Mercantile, actually. Shot back, grazed Robert's arm. You should have seen their faces." Sarah helped unload supplies, while Jake talked strategy with the gathering men. She noticed they all carried weapons now, moving in groups, watching each other's backs. The Mitchells had ruled through isolation, making each family feel alone. In their suffering, that power was breaking. "Mrs. Henderson," young Tom Burke approached, hat in hand. "Ma sent these." He held out a stack of letters. "From other families who lost land. She's been collecting stories for years, too afraid to use them. Until now, more evidence for their growing arsenal." Sarah thanked him, then froze as she saw dust on the main road. Riders approaching fast. "Mitchell men," Jake called softly. "Get the boys inside." But before Sarah could move, William's voice rang out, "Mr. Jake!" "Look!" They all turned to see what had caught the boys' attention. Behind the approaching Mitchell riders, more dust clouds rose, townsfolk on horses and wagons following the Mitchell men, not running away but keeping watch, bearing witness. "Well now," Jake said, something like pride in his voice, "looks like the whole town's decided to pay us a visit." The Mitchell riders pulled up short when they saw the crowd at Jake's cabin. Robert Mitchell's face was dark with rage, his arm bandaged where Thompson's shot had found him. "This is private." "Business, Cooper," he snarled. "Nothing private about justice," Jake replied calmly. "Or are you worried about having witnesses when you deliver your threats?" Robert's hand twitched toward his gun, but the movement died when he saw how many rifles casually turned his way. Not just Jake's supporters, but townspeople who'd followed them out. "You're making a mistake," Robert spat. "All of you. My father—" "Your father's empire is built on paper and fear," Jake cut in. "And paper burns, Mr. Mitchell. Fear fades. What will you have then?" Sarah saw the moment Robert realized he was losing control. His face twisted, and he wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over, Cooper. Tell your widow friend to watch her boys careful. Accidents happen." "Yes, they do," Jake agreed pleasantly. "Like what happened to Josh McAllister. Funny thing about accidents, they leave evidence, and we've got plenty of that." The Mitchell men rode off, but the damage was done. Their threats, witnessed by half the town, had only strengthened the resolve of those they'd meant to frighten. "They'll be back," Lewis Parker said quietly. "Yes." Jake was already writing, in his journal documenting the encounter. "But next time they'll find more than just me waiting, won't they?" The gathered crowd murmured agreement, and Sarah felt the power of it. Ordinary people finding their courage together, standing against the bullies who'd ruled their lives through. Fear. But Robert's threat about the boys echoed in her mind. The Mitchells were wounded animals now, and nothing was more dangerous than that. The original will emerged from Warner's safe like a ghost, its pages yellowed, but the ink still clear. The lawyer's hands trembled as he laid it on his desk, glancing nervously at the street outside his office. "Thomas brought this to me 3 days before he fell ill," Warner said quietly. "Made me swear to keep it secret, hidden in my personal safe, not the bank's. Said if anything happened to him." He swallowed hard. "I should have spoken up sooner." Sarah touched the familiar signature. Thomas's distinctive T with its extra loop, exactly as she remembered. The date showed clearly. Weeks before the fever, before the mysterious documents Augustus had produced. "This leaves everything to Sarah and the boys," Jake said, reading over her shoulder. "No mention of debts, no Mitchell claims." Thomas knew. "They were coming for him." Warner's voice shook. "That last day, he told me Augustus had been pressing him to sell, threatening to call in loans that didn't exist. He wanted everything documented, legitimate." The lawyer pulled out more papers. "These, too, records of all his dealings with the Mitchells. He kept copies of everything." Sarah read through the documents, her heart pounding. Here was proof of every lie, every manipulation. Records of Mitchell men harassing their neighbors, mysterious accidents befalling those who refused to sell. "Why didn't you bring this forward before?" Jake's voice held no accusation, just quiet understanding. Warner's shoulders slumped. "They have my daughter's mortgage in Cheyenne. Threaten to foreclose, take everything she has. I'm not proud of my silence, but a father protects his children," Sarah finished softly. "But now the whole territory's talking about a federal investigation. And after what Robert Mitchell did in town yesterday," Warner straightened his spine, "I'm done being afraid. These papers are yours. Copies are already on their way to the federal marshal in Denver." Jake nodded approvingly. "Smart man. Augustus. Can't stop what's already in motion." A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, they saw Augustus Mitchell himself striding down the street, his remaining sons flanking him like storm clouds. The morning sun caught the silver handles of their pistols. "Back door," Jake said quietly, gathering the documents. "Mrs. Henderson, time to go." But before they could move, the office door burst open. Augustus filled the doorway, his bulk casting the room into shadow. Sarah had forgotten how large he was, how his presence seemed to suck the air from a room. "Warner," he rumbled, "I'm disappointed. After all our years of mutual understanding." The lawyer stood straighter, though his face was pale. "It's over, Augustus. The truth's already out." "Truth?" Augustus laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "Truth is what I say it is. Truth is what I buy and sell. And you—" his eyes fixed on Sarah with cold fury. "You should have taken my offer, given up the boys, lived in peace. Now—" He reached into his coat. Jake's rifle appeared as if by magic, its barrel unwavering. "Careful, Mr. Mitchell. Wouldn't want any accidents. Not with so many witnesses." Augustus froze, finally noticing the townspeople gathering outside his office. Faces pressed against the windows. Shopkeepers, ranchers, families who'd lost. Everything to Mitchell greed, all watching, all bearing witness. "This is how it ends," Jake continued conversationally. "Not with violence, not with more threats, but with paper, your favorite weapon. Only this time, the documents tell the true story." "You think some moldering papers can stop me?" Augustus snarled. "I own this territory. One word from me—" "Look outside," Sarah cut in, her voice steady. "Your word doesn't carry as far as it used to." Augustus did look, and she saw the moment he understood. His empire wasn't built on paper after all. It was built on fear, and fear was evaporating in the clear Wyoming sunshine. "Father." Robert. Mitchell appeared in the doorway, his face tight. "Riders coming, federal marshals by the look of their badges." Jake smiled slightly. "Right on time. Warner's message must have reached Denver faster than we hoped." Augustus's face purpled. "This isn't over. You think you can destroy everything I've built? I'll bury you. I'll bury all of you." "No, Mr. Mitchell," Sarah said quietly, holding Thomas's true will like a shield. "You've done enough burying. Now it's time for truth to see the light." The thunder of approaching horses filled the street. Augustus looked from the documents to the windows full of watching faces, and Sarah saw something she'd never thought to see. Fear in the great man's eyes. The empire of Augustus Mitchell was about to fall, and all it had taken was the very weapon. He'd used to build it, papers, truth, and the courage of people finally ready to stand together. The marshal's badge caught the midday sun as Federal Marshal Daniel Harrison dismounted in front of Warner's office. Sarah recognized Jake's calm confidence in the man's movements, another veteran of hard choices and harder battles. "Cooper." Harrison nodded to Jake. "Been a while. Got your message about land fraud in the territory." His eyes swept over the gathered crowd, the armed Mitchell men, the tension crackling like lightning before a storm. "Though seems you left out a few details. Thought you'd enjoy the surprise." Jake's voice held dry humor, but his hand stayed near his rifle. "Augustus Mitchell, may I present Federal Marshal Harrison? He's particularly interested in land office corruption, studied law after the war, specialized in property theft cases." Augustus's face had gone the color of old chalk. "Whatever tales you've heard, Marshal, save it." Harrison's voice cracked like a whip. "Got sworn testimonies from 30 families about forged documents, fraudulent loans, mysterious accidents. Got a stack of evidence that's going to make territorial judges mighty interested." He smiled thinly. "And now I've got you threatening folks in broad daylight. Convenient." Robert Mitchell's hand twitched toward his gun. 3 federal deputies instantly had him covered, their rifles unwavering. "Son," Harrison said quietly, "that would be an extremely poor decision." For a moment, the street held its breath. Sarah felt the weight of history turning, of justice finally catching up to years of cruelty and greed. Then Augustus Mitchell showed why he'd held power so long. "My dear Marshal," he said smoothly, "all civilized concern. Clearly there have been misunderstandings. If you'll accompany me to my office, I have documentation proving every transaction was completely legal, like these." Warner stepped forward, holding Thomas's original will and papers. "Or perhaps you mean the documents in your bank safe, the ones Robert was so concerned about during yesterday's discussion." Augustus's mask slipped. "You, me," Warner's voice shook but held firm. "Along with every other person you've threatened and bullied. We're done being afraid, Augustus." The crowd murmured agreement. Sarah saw faces she recognized. The Burkes, the Wilsons, shopkeepers and ranchers who'd lost everything to Mitchell's schemes, all watching justice unfold with fierce satisfaction. "Arrest them!" Augustus snarled at the marshal. "They're conspiring to steal my legitimate property. Actually," Harrison cut in, "I have warrants for you and your sons. Federal charges, mail fraud, witness intimidation, conspiracy to commit murder." He pulled out official papers. "Josh McAllister's body was found last week, by the way. River finally gave up its secrets. The color drained from Robert Mitchell's face. His younger brother Edward took a step back, looking ready to bolt. "You can't," Augustus began. "Federal law supersedes territorial authority," Harrison continued implacably. "You've been operating across state lines, Mr. Mitchell. That makes this my jurisdiction." He turned to his deputies. "Secure them. Carefully." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Robert Mitchell went for his gun, despite the rifles trained on him. Edward tried to run. Augustus bellowed something about rights and property. The street erupted in shouts and movement, but before violence could explode, a single shot rang out. Everyone froze. Jake stood with his rifle raised, smoke curling from the barrel. Above their heads, the sign for Mitchell Enterprises swayed gently. A fresh bullet hole dead center through Augustus's engraved name. "Next one won't be aimed at wood," Jake said quietly. "Your choice, gentlemen." The Mitchell men stood still as the deputies moved in to disarm them. Sarah watched Augustus's face as the handcuffs closed around his wrists, saw the moment he realized his empire of fear had crumbled to dust. "The properties will be returned," Harrison announced to the crowd. "Federal court will oversee the process. Ensure everything's documented proper this time." He nodded to Sarah. "Starting with the Henderson Ranch." Relief swept through Sarah like a cool wind. But even as tears threatened, she noticed Jake tensing, his eyes scanning the rooftops. "Down!" he shouted suddenly, throwing her aside as a shot cracked from above. Chaos erupted. People screamed and scattered. The deputies returned fire at a shadow on the mercantile roof, one of Augustus's hired guns making a last, desperate play. More. Shots rang out, but the townspeople didn't run this time. They took cover and held their ground, some returning fire, others helping the federal men establish order. The fear that had ruled them for so long had transformed into something stronger. Determination. "Sarah!" Jake's voice held, barely controlled. "Panic! Are you hit?" "No." She caught her breath, protected behind a water trough. "The boys," safe in Warner's office. His eyes held hers for a moment, full of things unsaid. Then he was moving, rifle ready, coordinating with Harrison to outflank the shooter. The gunfight was brief but fierce. When it ended, Augustus's last loyal man lay wounded but alive, his weapon kicked away by federal boots. The Mitchell men were secured in reinforced wagons, their protests falling on deaf ears. 20 years, Harrison said, helping Sarah to her feet. 20 years of theft and intimidation ended in one morning. He looked at Jake. "Couldn't have done it without your groundwork, Cooper. You always did know how to fight the long war." Sarah watched Jake accept the praise with a quiet nod, saw how naturally he worked with these men of law and justice. The cavalry badge on his jacket wasn't just a reminder of the past. It was a symbol of the man he'd always been, one who fought for what was right, no matter how long it took. "Mrs. Henderson," William's voice came from Warner's doorway. "Can we come out now?" "Yes, sweetheart." She gathered both boys close, breathing in their familiar scents. "It's over. We're going home." "All of us?" James asked, looking at Jake with hope in his young face. Jake met Sarah's eyes over the boys' heads. "If your mama agrees," he said softly, "I'd be honored to help rebuild what was taken, make it better than before." Sarah thought of all they'd lost and all they'd gained. The Mitchell empire had fallen, but something stronger had risen in its place. Justice, courage, and a family forged in adversity's fire. "Yes," she said, taking Jake's calloused hand in hers. "All of us." Around them, the town buzzed with activity as Harrison's men began the massive task of unraveling 20 years of Mitchell corruption. But here, in this moment, Sarah felt nothing but peace. They had won their justice, not through violence or greed, but through truth and determination, and somewhere she knew Thomas was smiling. The property deed felt different this time in Sarah's hands, its fresh ink and official seals representing not just ownership, but justice. Marshal Harrison had insisted on handling the transfer himself, spreading the document on the ranch houses. Familiar kitchen table, her kitchen table once again. Every I dotted, every T crossed, Harrison said, his badge gleaming in the morning light streaming through windows that had been dark for too long. Federal court's ruling is final. The Henderson Ranch, with all its buildings, livestock, and associated property, is officially returned to its rightful owners. Sarah ran her fingers over Thomas's name, now joined by hers in the legal description. Behind her, Jake stood with a hand on each of her boys' shoulders, solid and steady as the mountains on the horizon. "The Mitchells' appeal?" she asked quietly. "Harrison's." Face hardened. "Denied. Augustus and Robert are facing federal charges, fraud, conspiracy, witness intimidation. Evidence from Josh McAllister's recovered papers sealed their fate. They won't trouble Wyoming territory again." The news rippled through the gathered crowd on her porch. Neighbors, friends, and families who'd come to witness this moment of restoration. Sarah saw Lewis Parker nodding in satisfaction, the Burke family holding each other close, Warner wiping tears from behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "There's more," Harrison continued, pulling out additional documents. "Federal courts ordered full restitution for every family affected by Mitchell fraud. Properties returned, damages paid from seized Mitchell assets." He smiled grimly. "Augustus's empire is being dismantled piece by piece, everything documented and verified." Sarah thought of the other families, scattered across the territory and beyond, who would receive similar news. The Burkes, the Wilsons, already in process. Martha Burke's getting her farm back, with compensation for lost years. Ben Wilson's children will have their inheritance restored. Harrison's eyes met Jake's. "Your intelligence network did good work, Cooper. Every story you collected, every piece of evidence you gathered, it all held up in federal court." Jake nodded quietly, but Sarah felt his hands tighten slightly on the boy's shoulders. She knew he was thinking of his own lost family, of justice that had come too late for them. But here now, he had helped prevent that same tragedy from destroying other lives. "What about Edward Mitchell?" James asked suddenly. "He wasn't as bad as the others." Harrison considered the boy's question seriously. "Turned state's evidence, testified against his father and brother. Court took that into account, along with his age when the fraud began. He'll serve some time, but with a chance at redemption." Sarah saw Jake nod approvingly at James's compassion. Her son was learning the difference between justice and vengeance, understanding that even in victory, mercy had its place. "Now," Harrison said, producing a final paper, "there's the matter of compensation for your family's specific losses." He named a figure that made Sarah's breath catch. "That's more than the ranch was worth. Interest, lost income, damages for wrongful eviction." Harrison's voice hardened. "And compensation for your husband's death. Medical examiner found trace of arsenic in samples from his exhumed remains. Robert Mitchell's confession confirmed our suspicions about Thomas's convenient fever." The room went silent. Sarah felt Jake step closer, his strength supporting her as the final piece of truth fell into place. She'd known somehow that Thomas's illness had been too sudden, too violent. But hearing it confirmed, "They killed my pa," William's small voice cracked. "Because he wouldn't sign? They killed him because he was a good man who stood against evil. Jake said quietly, kneeling to meet William's tear-filled eyes. He protected what was right, protected his family, just like you're learning to do. James moved to hug his brother, and Sarah saw Thomas in both of them, his strength, his compassion, his unwavering sense of justice. "The money," she said, gathering her composure, "will be shared with every family who helped us. Those who lost work for speaking out, who risked everything to stand with us." Harrison smiled. "Already done, Mrs. Henderson. Jake here insisted on it when we discussed settlements. Towns establishing a fund to help other families fight land. Fraud, using part of the Mitchell seizures." He began gathering his papers. "Speaking of which, I believe some folks are waiting outside to help you move back in." Sarah went to the door, and her heart swelled at what she saw. Wagons lined the drive, loaded with furniture, supplies, and helping hands. The community had come together, turning the ranch's restoration into a celebration of renewal. Tom Burke. "Found your mother's hope chest in a Mitchell storage barn," Jake said softly. "Lewis Parker's been caring for some of Thomas's Herefords on the sly. Even Mr. Buttons turned up this morning, looking mighty pleased with himself, as if summoned." The old tomcat strutted across the porch, heading straight for his favorite sunny spot by the door. Some things, it seemed, even the Mitchells couldn't change. "Jake," Sarah turned to him, needing to say what had gone unspoken through all their struggles. "What you did for us, for everyone, had to be done." His eyes held hers, storm cloud, grey softening like rain on dry earth. "But I didn't do it alone. You gave people courage, Sarah, showed them that standing together was stronger than standing aside. And now," she gestured at the bustling activity around them, "their new beginning, taking shape with every wagon unloaded, every helping hand offered. Now," Jake smiled slightly, "we build something better, something that can't be stolen or broken." He touched his cavalry badge, then slowly unpinned it. "Been carrying this reminder of war and loss for too long. Time to pin my faith on peace. Instead," he held out the badge to James. "What do you say, son? Think you could help me turn this ranch into something your pa would be proud of?" James took the badge carefully, his eyes bright with unshed tears and new hope. "Yes, sir, we all could." Sarah watched her boys examine the badge with their heads together, saw the future taking shape in their renewed sense of security and purpose. The property deed on her table was more than just a piece of paper now. It was a foundation for something stronger than ownership. It was a promise of justice served, of community restored, of love blooming in ground that had been salted with greed and fear. And as Jake's hand found hers, warm and sure and full of tomorrow's possibilities, Sarah knew that some debts could be repaid with hope instead of blood. The new family portrait hung in the restored parlor, a simple daguerreotype showing Sarah, the boys, and Jake on the ranch's front porch. It had been Lewis Parker's idea. "Time to make new memories," he'd said, bringing the photographer from town as his contribution to the rebuilding effort. Sarah studied the image while morning sunlight streamed through freshly washed windows. They looked different than in older pictures, stronger perhaps, or just more aware of their strength. James stood tall beside Jake, wearing the cavalry badge on his Sunday vest. William sat on the porch steps with Mr. Buttons in his lap, his smile finally reaching his eyes again. And Jake. Sarah touched the glass over his face, remembering how he'd almost declined to be in the portrait. "It's your family photo," he'd said gruffly. "Yes," she'd replied, "it is." Outside she could hear him now, teaching James the finer points of horse training. The boy's confidence had grown daily since they'd returned to the ranch, nurtured by Jake's patient guidance and unwavering support. "Keep your hands soft on the reins," Jake's voice carried through the open window. "Horse'll tell you what they're thinking if you learn to listen right." "Like you listen to people's stories?" James asked. "When you were gathering evidence?" Pause. Then Jake's thoughtful response. "Reckon that's not so different. Whether it's horses or people, trust has to be earned, can't be forced or bought." Sarah moved to the kitchen, where William was carefully copying recipes from her mother's cookbook into a new journal. The Mitchell men had used the original for kindling, but Sarah had remembered enough to recreate most of them. Some things, she'd learned, lived stronger in heart and memory than on paper. "Mama?" William looked up from his careful writing. "Can we make Pa's favorite apple cake for the gathering tomorrow?" "Of course, sweetheart." Sarah ran a hand over his hair, so like Thomas's in the sunlight. "I think he'd like that." The gathering was another of Lewis Parker's ideas, a community celebration of not just the Henderson Ranch's restoration, but of all the families receiving justice. The Burkes were back on their farm, the Wilsons returning to their land. Even families who'd left the territory years ago were trickling back, drawn by news of the Mitchell Empire's fall and the federal court's restitution orders. A knock at the door revealed Martha Burke, her arms full of quilting supplies. "Hope I'm not too early," she said, eyes bright with purpose. "Thought we might work on the wedding quilt while the menfolk are occupied with horses." Sarah felt her cheeks warm. She hadn't said yes to Jake's proposal yet, hadn't even told anyone he'd asked. But somehow, Martha knew, the way women who'd weathered storms together often did. "Come in," she said, taking some of Martha's burden. "William, would you fetch the quilting frame from the front bedroom?" They worked in companionable silence, piecing together fragments of memory and hope. Martha had saved scraps from Sarah's, mother's quilts, rescued from the Mitchells' careless destruction. New fabric brought by neighbors added fresh colors and patterns, creating something both familiar and new. Like the territory itself, Martha mused, running her fingers over the emerging design. Built from pieces of what was, but stronger for being sewn together. From the barn came the sound of James's laughter, followed by Jake's deeper chuckle. Sarah smiled, remembering the quiet man who'd first offered them shelter, who'd fought so long and carefully for justice. He'd changed too, softened somehow, without losing his strength, like iron tempered into steel. "He's a good man," Martha said quietly, following Sarah's gaze toward the barn. "Known him 8 years, never saw him smile much before you and the boys came along." Sarah threaded her needle with care. He had his reasons for being serious. "Had," Martha emphasized. "Past tense. Man's got future in his eyes now, and it's wearing your face." She grinned at Sarah's blush. "Oh, don't play coy. Whole town's been watching this story unfold, betting on when you two would figure it out." "Martha Burke, I doubt the whole town." "Mama!" William's excited voice cut in. "Mr. Jake's teaching James to break the new colt. Come see." They moved to the window, watching Jake demonstrate proper technique while James observed intently. The young horse danced nervously, but Jake's quiet confidence seemed to flow through the lead rope, calming the animal with practiced ease. "See how he stays relaxed?" Jake was saying. "Horse picks up on what you're feeling. You want them to trust you, you have to trust yourself first." Sarah thought of all the trust that had been broken and rebuilt in recent months, in justice, in community, in the possibility of new beginnings. The portrait behind her caught the morning light, its simple image reflecting a truth deeper than any legal document. Family wasn't just about blood or names on paper. It was about choice, about people deciding to stand together, to build something stronger than what life had torn down. "Time for lunch," she called through the window. "Martha's staying." Jake looked up, his eyes meeting hers with quiet joy, and Sarah knew her answer to his question would be yes. Some things, after all, were as clear as Wyoming sky after storm clouds passed. The wedding ring caught the sunset light as Jake held it out, a simple gold band that had survived war, loss, and 20 years of waiting. His mother's ring, he'd explained. The only piece of his past he'd never considered selling, even in the hardest times. "She'd have liked you," he said softly, standing with Sarah by the split-rail fence where they'd first talked about justice and hope. "Said the ring would know when it found the right hands to hold our family's future." Sarah touched the worn gold, feeling its warmth. "You kept it all this time?" "Kept it in trust, I reckon." Jake's voice held quiet certainty. "Like I kept fighting the Mitchells, like I kept believing justice would come. Some things are worth waiting for." From the barn came the sounds of James and William doing evening chores, their voices mixing with the comfortable noises of horses and cattle settling in for the night. Mr. Buttons supervised from his perch. On the fence, his orange fur painted golden by the dying sun. "I'm not trying to replace Thomas," Jake said carefully. "Man deserves to rest easy, knowing his boys are growing into men he'd be proud of." "I know." Sarah stepped closer, letting her hand find his. "And I'm not trying to replace Rebecca. Some loves don't need replacing, just honoring while we build something new." Jake's fingers tightened on hers. "That's what I'm asking for. A chance to build, to grow something stronger than what was lost." He took a deep breath. "Sarah Henderson, would you consider becoming Sarah Cooper? Letting me help raise those boys, work this land, face whatever comes next together?" Before she could answer, a whoop came from the barn doorway. "She'd better say yes," James called out. "We already told Marshal Harrison to come back for the wedding." James Thomas Henderson. Sarah tried to sound stern, but laughter bubbled up instead. "Were you eavesdropping?" "No, ma'am," her eldest said with suspicious innocence. "Just happened to be checking on that loose board." "Right, William." William's face appeared beside his brother's, grinning. "Mr. Jake asked us first, Mama. Last week when we were mending fences. Said it wasn't right to court a lady without her menfolk's approval." Sarah turned to Jake, who looked slightly abashed. "Did you now?" Seemed proper. His eyes held a hint of mischief. "Course, if you say no, might have some explaining to do. Town's been planning this celebration for weeks. The quilting circle's almost finished with the wedding quilt," William added helpfully. "Mrs. Burke said we're not supposed to tell you that part, though." Sarah laughed, feeling joy bubble up like a spring creek after winter thaw. "Seems I'm the last to know my own mind." "Not last," Jake said softly. "Just giving you time to be sure." After everything that happened, he touched his cavalry badge on James's vest. "Woman who's fought as hard as you have for her family deserves to make choices in her own time." The setting sun painted the ranch in shades of gold and promise. Sarah looked at her boys, Thomas's sons, who'd somehow become Jake's boys too in all the ways that mattered. Looked at this quiet man who'd fought so long for justice, who'd taught her children that strength could be gentle and courage could be patient. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it." Jake's smile dawned slow and sure as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Behind them, the boys whooped and hollered, their celebration sending horses nickering in the barn and Mr. Buttons stalking away in affronted dignity. "Does this mean we can tell everyone at tomorrow's gathering?" William asked eagerly. "Reckon they already know, son." Jake's voice held warm amusement. "Small towns don't keep secrets well, except the ones that matter," Sarah said softly, thinking. Of all the evidence they'd gathered, all the careful planning that had brought down the Mitchell Empire, Jake nodded, understanding. Those aren't secrets anymore, they're history. Story of how good people stood together, chose justice over fear. He looked at the ring on her finger. "Time to write new stories now." James came forward, suddenly serious. "Pa would want you to be happy, Mama. He told me that once when he was sick. Said a family's love grows bigger, not smaller, when you share it right." Sarah gathered her son close, feeling Jake's strong arm slide around them both as William joined the embrace. The ring caught the last rays of sunset, its gold warming to the color of hope and new beginnings. Together, they watched darkness soften into evening. 4 people becoming a family as naturally as day turning to dusk, and trust blooming into love. A year later, the fresh-carved fence post stood proud at the ranch entrance, its new sign reading Cooper Ranch in bold letters beneath the original Henderson that Jake had insisted on keeping. "A family's legacy," he'd said, "is meant to grow, not replace what came before." Sarah stood beside it now, watching the spring sunrise paint the Wyoming sky in colors of renewal. The past year had brought changes as natural as seasons turning, James growing tall and confident under Jake's guidance, William's laughter returning to fill the house, their makeshift family becoming something stronger than blood or law could define. Marshal Harrison had returned last month, bringing news that Augustus Mitchell had died in prison, taking his bitterness to the grave. Robert Mitchell was serving his sentence, but Edward had earned early release for good behavior, heading east to start fresh. The territory itself had changed too, healing old wounds as families returned and communities rebuilt. "Penny, for your thoughts, Mrs. Cooper?" Jake's arms slid around her waist, his voice warm in the morning air. "Just thinking about transitions," she said, leaning back against him. "How ending one story means beginning another." From the barn came the sound of James teaching William the horse-training techniques Jake had passed down. Mr. Buttons supervised from his favorite sunning spot, grown fat and content on ranch mice and daily cream. "Speaking of new stories," Jake said quietly, "got a letter from Martha Burke yesterday. Her eldest is courting the Wilson girl. Families that once lost everything to Mitchell greed, now joining together in hope instead of sorrow." Sarah smiled, touching the fence post where their combined names declared both history and future. Thomas would have liked that. He always said justice was about building up, not just tearing down. "Wise man." Jake's hand covered hers on the carved wood. "Raised sons who prove it every day." As if summoned by their words, the boys appeared, leading their horses for the morning ride to check fence lines. James wore his responsibility as young ranch foreman with quiet pride, while William had become the territory's best hand at gentling frightened colts. "Race you to Fisher Creek," William called to his brother, then remembered to add, "if Mama and Pa say it's all right." Sarah laughed at Jake's mock-stern expression. "Go on then, but mind that new foal in the north pasture. She's still shy of riders." They watched their sons ride out, the morning sun at their backs casting long shadows across land that had known both sorrow and joy. The ranch was flourishing under their combined care, its boundaries marked now by trust rather than territory, you know," Jake said softly. "Some folks might say we won this land back through justice and law. But I reckon we won something better." He turned her gently to face him. "We won the right to build a future worth having, to show those boys that love and courage matter more than power and greed." Sarah stretched up to kiss him, feeling the rightness of their shared path. Behind them, the carved fence post stood as witness to a simple truth. Sometimes justice wore the face of morning light on prairie grass, of family pieced together by choice and chance, of love rebuilt on foundation, stones of courage and hope, and that she knew was the greatest victory of all.